American English, American English, webinar series. Teach and learn. American English, webinar series.
Hello again out there, teachers all around the world. Welcome everyone to the final webinar in American English Webinar Series 4, brought to you by the American English team at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. Let's begin today with a look at this great photo submitted by Swad Madani Tazi, featuring teachers gathered at the Information Resource Center in Rabat, Morocco. They were participating in a webinar earlier in Series 4. Thank you to everyone who sent in photos during this series. Please do share any pictures from today's webinar viewing groups by emailing them to americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org. We may feature them at the start of Series 5. My name is Heather Benucci. You also know me as Moderator Heather. Joining me today is one of our newest team members, Moderator Katie, a different Moderator Katie than in the past, but Katie will be here along with me to help support you today during the webinar. You'll see us in the chat box. And here's a look back at the exciting topics we covered in Series 4. We looked at everything from using humor in the classroom to working with young learners, focusing on how to teach academic writing effectively, and lately we've been focusing on using technology in our classrooms. Are there any of these webinars that have been your favorite so far? As you know, our webinars each last 60 minutes, and they are related to a theme that is on the American English website in the Teacher's Corner. And you can access the Teacher's Corner on the American English website either using the ribbon at the top of the website or the English Teaching Resources section at the bottom center of the page. The theme for November is Education, Trends, and Issues in the World Today. As you know, you will participate today primarily through typing in the chat box. That is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. We might not be able to answer every question during the session as there are often hundreds of teachers participating. However, you can have those questions addressed after the session on the Ning community that we'll look at in more detail in just a moment. Today's presenter will also ask you questions in the form of polls. These multiple choice and multiple answers questions will appear on the screen for you to complete. And unfortunately, some people may experience technical problems during the webinar. We're going to let you know if we have a global issue and we will work to help you solve it. If you do lose sound, however, you can follow along with the caption pod at the bottom of the screen if refreshing your internet browser and adjusting your speakers doesn't correct the issue. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars will receive an e-certificate of participation from their regional English language officer or local U.S. embassy. E-certificates are issued locally several weeks after the series ends today. If you don't receive your e-certificate after approximately 6 weeks, please first attempt to contact your RELO or local U.S. embassy point of contact. And if you still require assistance, then contact American English Webinars at elprograms.org for additional help. And to ensure that you are eligible for that e-certificate, we are going to ask you to submit your attendance details at the very end of the webinar. We will provide you instructions, you will follow an internet link, and then submit the information using a form as requested. And most of you are active members on our Ning community site, but if you haven't registered yet, we do hope you'll join us. It may take up to 72 hours for your Ning registration to be approved. Here on the Ning, you'll be able to find resources and discussion questions related to our webinars, as well as the recordings and featured materials for each session. The Ning is also where you can ask the presenter questions after the webinar, and you can live chat with your fellow community members there. And I'm really excited to announce the themes and topics for American English Webinar Series 5. It will begin on January 18th, 2017, and we will have our own moderators Kate Bain and Lauren Whitaker focusing on bringing learning to life with grammar games. In February, the webinars will relate to journalism, and our two sessions for this theme are about using news sources in the EFL classroom and creating current event activities with free resources from Voice of America. Finally, in March, we will examine how to increase learner engagement with webinars related to visual literacy, learner training, and using photographs and images in the EFL classroom. Even if you've participated in the current series, you will need to register again with your Regional English Language Office or local U.S. Embassy point of contact. Please see the NING announcements in the event section for additional information about Series 5. And now on to today's session, Classroom 2.0, Tools for Digital Learning. In this webinar, we will investigate terminology associated with digital learning, and we will consider how to evaluate and select tech tools for the EFL classroom. We will then explore several digital tools that teachers can use to support students, deliver content, and create engaging activities in both face-to-face and distance learning contexts. New to digital learning? No problem. Our presenter will share ideas and tools appropriate for teachers with all levels of experience. And it is my great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Jeff Kuhn. Jeff is a PhD candidate in the Educational Technology Division of the Patton College of Education at Ohio University and an instructor in the departments of both linguistics and English. Jeff taught EFL in Japan and served in the Peace Corps in Mongolia as a teacher trainer before receiving his master's degree in linguistics. He's also worked as a consultant for the U.S. Department of State's Trace Effects video game for English language learners around the world. Jeff has presented on the use of games in the classroom at eTech Ohio, TESOL, and Calico. His research interests include computer-assisted language learning, or CALL.
Thanks, Heather. I hope everyone is doing well today. I'm glad to be here for the final webinar in the American English Webinar Series 4. And so we have lots of people here today, over 200 people in the webinar and many more watching together in groups. So wherever you are, whether that's Peru, Sudan, Nepal, or anywhere in between, thank you for being here today. And as Heather mentioned, we are going to talk about Classroom 2.0, Tools for Digital Learning. And I'm really excited to have you here joining me for this webinar. And I want to start by talking about our pre-webinar polls. And so it looked like for most of us, we haven't had much experience with the term blended learning. And so we're going to work on that a little bit today and talk about what is blended learning and how we can use it for language learning and teaching. And also with the pre-webinar poll, looking at cell phone use. So it looked like for most of us, we can have our students using cell phones in the class for specific purposes. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Really what we want to do today is look at tools that we can use in our teaching context and how students can access those tools, whether that's computers, cell phones, tablets, whatever we have that will work. And so let's kick things off and just talk a little bit about technology in the classroom. Now, one reason I like to use technology in the classroom is that it allows my students to interact more and helps me make my class more participatory. And when I say participatory, I mean getting more of my students to interact with me as a teacher and with their classmates. In my traditional, face-to-face classes, I will often have one, maybe two students who really answer most of the questions. And as a result, I've looked for tools that can get more of my students participating in the classroom. How do I get those shy students? How do I get those reluctant students to contribute more in class? And doing that, I've kind of come across a a series of tools that I really like to use in my classroom to make my class more blended between face-to-face and online. And so I'd like to share some of those tools with you today and discuss how we can fit them into our teaching practice. Now, before we do that, I'd like to do one more poll here. So let's bring up the poll. And my questions are, have you ever taught an online class? And have you ever taught a blended or hybrid course? Looks like we have most people saying no, they've never taught an online course. And most people, actually about 70% of us saying we've never taught a blended or a hybrid course. Okay, that's an interesting place to start because we're going to really kind of unpack or understand this definition of blended learning and what it means. So we'll see if that changes, if those numbers change. So let's go back to our presentation. And to kick off our webinar for the day, let's talk about our goals. What are our goals for the webinar? So really the first thing we want to do, maybe go back there, is to define the term connected learning. Define the terms connected to digital learning. And then the next thing we want to do is examine a framework for evaluating educational technology tools. How do we choose the right tool? And then finally, I'd like to show you some of the digital tools that I like to use in my classroom to get my students more engaged and to get my students participating much more. So we'll get an overview of this term, digital learning, and some of the other terms associated with digital learning, and then what tools we can use, and then we'll investigate those specific tools. So that's our plan for today. So let's get started. Now, the best place to start when talking digital tools is with the terms we hear when we discuss these tools. So let's sort out some of these terms because we have face-to-face learning, we have online learning, blended or hybrid learning, and you also may have heard massive open online courses. Well, how do we unpack those a little bit? Let's take a look. So our traditional classrooms, teaching with the book and with the chalkboard, that's what we refer to as a face-to-face classroom. This is what we think of when we discuss classroom-based teaching. The students are at their desks, the teacher is at the chalkboard, maybe there's a lecture involved or book work involved. That's sort of the very traditional, face-to-face classroom. And on the other end of that scale, on the other side, we have online learning. And that's usually distance learning or massively open online courses. These are courses that take place entirely on the internet. There may be very little interaction between the teachers and the students. And what we're going to talk about today is right there in the middle. So we want to talk about this idea of blended or hybrid learning. And so between these two ends of our scale here, right there in the middle is blended or hybrid learning. And for our webinar today, I'm really going to stick with blended learning. Although you may see the term hybrid learning used as well, and they mean the same thing. So the definition of blended learning can be tricky or difficult because we're not quite sure what that means yet. Much of this technology is still very new, and so we're still trying to work through what it means. But really, blended learning is when we use technology or internet-based tools in our face-to-face classroom. So we might have an online component in our face-to-face classroom. Now, when we think about this, a blended learning classroom can be more than just technology in the classroom. A blended classroom can also be one that mixes face-to-face learning and online learning. So for example, you might teach your students face-to-face on Monday, and they do online or self-study on Tuesday. That would be a big example of blended learning. Well, there's also individual classes that we can think of as blended learning. Another example would be using technology for group work or self-study during one class period. For example, if you lecture students and then have them do task-based learning or self-study in the classroom, well, that would be blended learning too. So really, when we think about this idea of blended learning, the simple answer is when we start using technology or an internet component in our class, that's a blended learning classroom. So why do this? Why have a blended class? Well, when using technology tools in the classroom, we should have three big goals for using the technology. We want the technology to complement face-to-face work. So students may do book work and then move to an online activity where they can expand that idea more, be more creative with their language. So it could complement book work, it could complement a lecture that we give as teachers to our students. They could learn some grammar structure and then practice online. Other things we can do, and very similar, is to reduce student seat time. By seat time, I mean the time students spend in class sitting and listening. Instead of just having them listen to a lecture, how can we get them more active and more hands-on, more project-based, task-based learning? So how do we reduce our student seat time and make them more active, participatory learners? And of course, finally, these web-based tools should really take advantage of the best features of each. And so how do we kind of make sure that the technology supports what we're trying to teach? And how do we make sure our teaching includes the technology? Well, this can be kind of tricky to do. And so we need to kind of discuss how we can do that. What's the best approach? Because really, when we think about this, picking the right tool is the first place to start. And that choice can be really important. Well, with these three ideas in mind, let's look at some technology tools and more importantly, how to choose those tools. So here in the next part of the webinar, keep these ideas in mind as we think about how to evaluate technology tools. Now, when I ask myself if a technology tool will be a good fit for my classroom, I like to use Carol Chappell's 2001 criteria for evaluating technology in the language classroom. And so this is what I like to use, and I'll explain what this is next, but I do have a chat box question for everyone. How do you select digital learning tools to use in your class? Prakash says mobile, so looking at maybe applications that are very mobile that can be used on a phone. Lee Collins says laptops. I like Yesenia's answer, teachers must have those clear objectives, right? What do I want to teach and how will the technology help me? So Ramila says something similar, right? Something has to be based on the lesson. Well, Dariella has a great point. I look at what other classes are using, right? That can be a really great thing. Find out what other teachers are doing. And that's the great part about the webinar series here and the Ning website. So jump over to the American English Ning after this, because we can share those ideas not just with our colleagues at our school, but our colleagues around the world. Free applications. Definitely, and the ones we're going to look at today are free to use, so that'll be a good thing to keep up. Nick says, pick ideas based on lesson aims and interests of students. Again, these are kind of great general guidelines for choosing the right tool. And so with Carol Chappell's criteria, I want to focus this down just a little bit more and look at 6 ways that I like to select my technology for my classroom. Now, the first way, the first criteria that I like to think about when I'm evaluating technology is language learning potential. I like to ask myself, can this tool help me teach something more effectively? Or can my students use the tool to practice language skills outside of the classroom? This is always a critical question for me. If I answer no to those questions, I'm not going to use that technology. Sometimes a technology just won't work. Now, what's great for us as language teachers is many of the tools will really work for us. Math teachers, science teachers, history teachers, they may have a little more difficulty in finding tools that have potential, but for us, language learning potential is everywhere, which makes it much easier for us. And so it's great to be a language teacher. Now, something that's a little trickier, something a little more difficult is learner fit. Some tools, some tools are great for learners of all ages. They're just fantastic tools, but some are not. Be sure to consider your students' ages, language levels, technology abilities before using a tool in class. If students are expected to use a tool for class, but they don't know how, it can be very frustrating. And this is why it can be difficult to recommend a piece of technology for everyone, right? Because we have to evaluate each of them in terms of our own students, and who knows your students better than you? Well, really no one except for the students themselves. And so ask yourself, with each of the tools we look at today, each of the technology tools that you see in the future, does the technology match my students' needs and abilities? Will it be easy for them to use and understand? This is really important because it will help keep them from being frustrated. And importantly, too, give your students time to play with the technology. Once students have practiced with the tool, you'll get much better results. So the first time we use it in class, it may not go very well because the students are learning how to use the tool. You're learning how the students interact with the tool. But the second time, the third time, the 20th time you use it, you'll be much more successful. And remember to give yourself time to play with the tool as well. Before using any technology in the classroom, spend a few hours trying it out yourself and seeing how it works. Now, the third criteria that I like to use is what Carol Chappell calls meaning focus. So we have to decide how to use technology to teach specific language material. And this goes back a little bit to an idea of fun. We always think of technology as motivating or engaging or fun. A tool may be fun for our students, but are they learning? So when bringing a tool into the classroom, we should ask ourselves, how will this tool help me deliver learning? What do I want to teach with this technology? If we have a tool, but we don't know what to teach with it, we shouldn't use it. Even if it is, motivating and engaging, we want to make sure that it really is direct and focused. Having technology that supports our lesson goals, our lesson objectives, is always a critical component. Now, when we think about meaning, something that's similar to that we should consider too is it meaningful to the language we want to teach? And is it meaningful to our students? And that's what we call authenticity. And so that's the next criteria of Carol Chappell, is authenticity. Does the technology let my students use language in creative ways? Do they get to see and use language in a specific context? Because a great reason to use technology in the classroom is to bring more authenticity to our classrooms. When we use technology that can help our students be creative in their language, for example, they may do a textbook exercise and there's often only one correct answer. Well, if we use technology, we want to use it to give students more freedom to answer and use their language in new and creative ways. Allow for multiple answers. That's what I like to think about when I think about technology is, does it let my students do new things with their language? Does it allow them to be creative? And this goes into Carol Chappell's fifth idea, and that is positive impact. So we want to make sure that we use technology in class and that it helps our students be successful. Technology that demotivates our students or punishes them in some way can really have a negative influence on their learning. Instead, we want to look for tools that provide a positive impact. So, for example, in my classes, I struggle with getting shy students or less confident students to speak. They won't speak in my speaking class. So what do? I look for technology tools that allow students to ask and answer questions in class anonymously. So they don't have their name associated. They don't have to raise their hand. Instead, they can use the technology to ask questions. So how do I reach out to those shy students, those less confident students? One way is, by hiding their names. It gives them more opportunities to speak out in class. And so my question now here in the chat box is, what do you think are some ways technology can have a positive impact on our students? See some answers coming in the chat box there. Motivates them, right? Feel more confident. And they feel more comfortable to participate. That's what Liliana says. And I agree. But part of that comes in with giving them the time to practice. Students may not be comfortable with the technology the first time, but over time they'll get used to it. Right? Martha says they love to get data from it. Exactly. There's a lot of great stuff with the data that we can get from technology and learn more about our students, learn more about how we're teaching as well. Self-esteem is another one that came up. Right. A lot of times when students can practice without the pressure of other students watching, it can really kind of boost their self-esteem because they get to practice on their own first. Saad says they're comfortable to present their opinions. Right. So this technology can often give them a chance to speak out when they wouldn't normally speak. And these are all great ways to kind of think about what would be the positive impact on my students. And again, if you can't really think about a positive impact for some technology, I'm not sure it's worth using. Aziza says practice more, and that's one of my favorite parts of technology. We're teachers. We have to work, we have to grade papers, we also have to go home and do laundry and sleep and those other daily life activities. Technology is available 24 hours a day for many of our students, so they can keep practicing over and over again, which is another great aspect of it. And we'll look at some tools for things like that a little bit later on. But let's jump to our last piece of criteria, and that's practicality. By far, it's the most important thing to think about when we think about technology. Before bringing technology into the classroom, be sure it will work. If we set up time for the technology and it's too long to set up, or we lack the resources in the classroom to use the technology, then we really shouldn't use it. Sometimes pen and paper are still the best approach. So I always like to evaluate that when I ask myself, maybe this is better just on pen and paper. It probably is. When I start to question it, it's probably better to do it on pen and paper. So how practical is some technology for your classroom is an important thing to think about. I actually think it's probably the most important right after positive impact. And it may change. How practical something is may change depending on our students. It may depend on the classroom we're teaching in. And so, keep these things in mind as we look through the tools later on in the webinar, because these 6 criteria can go a long way in helping you make the best choices with technology for your classroom. when you want to move from a face-to-face to a more blended classroom approach. Now, when using these tools, there's always reasons to not try a piece of technology. Maybe it's too difficult to learn, or we won't have the technology in our classroom. When thinking about technology, I always like to stress, do what you can, where you are, with what you have. Personally, I have taught in very well-equipped computer labs with everything I'd need as a teacher. And I've taught in rooms where I just had chalk and a chalkboard. And I've still found ways to make technology work. It really is a matter of being creative. And so even if you have a classroom that's not really ready for technology, well, I'm glad you're here and you're learning now and exploring now, because when the technology comes to your classroom, you will be ready. And so don't just think about the teaching you're going to do now. Think about the teaching you're going to do next year and in 2 years, and plan accordingly. Right? As Tanya says, teachers are some of the most creative people you'll ever meet. And so keep that in mind as we go through some of these tools, because creativity is really the most important part of using technology in any classroom. Now, as we start focusing in on some of these tools, I do have a question for everyone, and that goes back to this idea of cell phones, specifically smartphones. Now, a smartphone is a cell phone that allows web access or internet access. And so my question for everyone before we look at the specific tools I have in mind is, how many of your students have smartphones? So it looks like about 70% of us have most of our students with smartphones. These are phones that they can send text messages, but also access the internet, maybe have email, things like that, WhatsApp, for instance. And this is something to think about. If you don't have computers in your classroom or a lab, if you don't have tablets, the other thing you can think about is, how can we have students use their cell phones, their smartphones? If not every student has a smartphone, could we get them to work in groups and do pair work or group work? Again, a little bit of creativity here will go a long way. So the tools that I'm going to be looking at today, and the tools I'm going to talk about specifically, can all be used on a computer. They can all be used on a tablet, or they could all be used on a smartphone, depending on what you and your students have available. So let's jump back to the presentation, and I want to talk very quickly about the types of technology out there on the internet today. Many of the tools that are available for teachers these days operate under what they call a freemium approach. They're freemium products. And that means they have a very basic version that's free to use. And if we want more features, if we want more availability from these products, we may have to pay a subscription or buy the software. But for today, for the tools that I'm recommending, they are all free to use. And the basic version is really all you need. I've tried all these out in my own class, and these are just my recommendations, and there are tons of other options as well. And another thing that I like about the tools I'm showing today is that they don't require students to sign up. I always get a little bit worried when my students need to log into something, because they'll forget their username, they'll forget their password, and it gets messy. So Practicality, talking about Carol Chappelle's 6 criteria, practicality for me is, it's got to be free, and my students don't need to sign up. So let's take a look at some of these tools. Now, the first type of tool when we think about a blended learning classroom is, how do we deliver information to our students? So just like in the real world, we have a classroom where all our students come together. We want to have a place on the internet for our students to come together and get information and interact. So I like to think about an online platform as my my classroom space on the internet. So some popular options are Moodle, Canvas, Schoology. I've even seen teachers teach classes completely in WhatsApp, which I think is a fantastic way of doing what you can where you are with what you have. And so, a quick poll question for everyone, and you can check all of the options that apply to you. What digital tools do you already use in the classroom? Lots of people clicking mobile applications there first. And so the tools that I'm showing today all have a mobile version that you can use. So it looks like a good fit already for some folks. Social media tools, wow, about 27% of the group sees social media tools. Another big one is a smartboard, electronic whiteboard. And we also have software programs in a computer lab. So the tools I'm recommending, they're all web-based. And so that way, whether you're in the computer lab or in your classroom, you won't have to download special software. If you have internet web browser, Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, you'll be able to access these websites. So let's go back to the poll. Go back to the presentation and talk a little bit more about these online platforms. So the one that I prefer to use is Padlet, and it, like any of the others, is just a space to direct students to online class materials. So I like to use these platforms to get my students focused on material, and it also is great to share materials between teachers. And as I mentioned, I really like Padlet. So if your school doesn't have an online platform such as Moodle or Canvas or Blackboard, Padlet can be a great option for getting started. And it's an online bulletin board. So you start with an empty page that you can fill with links that your students can click on and access. For example, what you see here is my Padlet page of technology tools for the classroom. So this is my online classroom for my blended class. This is where all my students can go and find our internet-based material. So students have a link to this page and they can access the material anytime, day or night. Now, when you start Padlet, you start with an empty page. Just like a bulletin board, I can start placing things on there that I want my students to see. So it just works by clicking a little plus button down in the corner. My add button allows me to place a text box on the page. And once I place that text box, I can add writing. I can add materials, so video, audio, reading material. And once I put it on there, I can just post it, and then my students have access to it. So they can go to my Padlet page, click on a particular item, open it up, they can download it, they can read it, they can post a response. And so it's a great place to put all our material and keep it all in one place on the internet. So that really is kind of the core of my blended teaching class, is this online platform. So thinking about that, I often use it outside of class. That's where students can go when they're doing their homework. That's where they can go to find information. And the other tools we'll look at are the ones I like to use in my classroom. But for now, this is like my foundation, and this can make things much easier in a blended class, because if students are given too many links to too many different websites, they may become lost or confused during the activity. With my Padlet page, students only have to remember that link, and the rest of the material I can keep there, so it keeps me and my students organized online. Now, another type of tool that I enjoy using in the classroom is question and answer software. So earlier when we discussed Carol Chappell's 6 criteria for technology in the classroom, we talked about positive impact. This is why I use question and answer software. Some of my students are shy and they do not often talk in class. So by using question and answer software, I can get more of my students participating in class, which is always a good thing. Now, one of the reasons I like to use this question and answer software is it gets more of my students engaged. If I have a very large class, I can have all of my students answering a question versus one or two. It can also give my shy students an opportunity to ask questions. And one of my colleagues, she has a great idea where she keeps her Poll Everywhere page, her question answer software open, and students can ask questions when they're at home doing their homework. Then during the next class, she comes in, opens up her web page, and she can answer those students' questions. So it's a great way to work with students, not just in the classroom, but outside the classroom as well. Now, these polling softwares, these question and answer softwares, when we can just ask a question, get an answer, they use what they call a second screen approach. And the way this works is my students all have their own screen, whether that's a computer screen, tablet, or a phone, a smartphone. They can type their questions or type their answers on their phone, and their information is sent over the internet to the teacher's screen or the teacher's website. So each student has their own kind of second screen that they use to interact in the classroom. And I'll show you how that works. So we'll look at this through the use of Poll Everywhere, which is the question and answer software that I like to use. So the way this works is I can go in and I can write a question and I can post that to my Poll Everywhere page, and my students can then answer the question through their own phone by visiting my Poll Everywhere website. So up at the top, I have pollev.com/JK341. That's my poll website. When you use this tool, you'll have a separate website that you can use with your students. And my students go to that website, and when they do, there's a screen that opens up, and they can ask any question they like, or they can answer the question I have up on the screen. So this screen is what students see on their computer, tablet, or smartphone screen. So when your question is displayed on your teacher screen, students can type their answers on their second screen. Now, we saw an example of an open-ended question, but we can also have more controlled questions. So we can do things like multiple choice. So I can give my students 4 answers or 5 answers to choose from, and they can answer accordingly. So as my students answer, this will update, very similar to the poll that we're using here in the webinar. So I'm able to do this in my classroom, which can be great when we're practicing grammar or practicing vocabulary. So we can see how everybody's answering all the questions. And so one of the things to think about with these question and answer softwares is, how we can get students more engaged with our classroom lectures or our classroom presentations. And so along with the question and answer software, I also like to do new things with presentation software. How do we move beyond a typical classroom lecture? So in a face-to-face classroom, we may provide students a lecture or an explanation of grammar or vocabulary, then later give them a quiz. But with a blended learning approach, we could use tools that allow us to give a lecture and a quiz at the same time. So how do I know that my students understand the material, that they're following along, and that they're really learning versus just kind of sitting there and listening? And so I like to use some different presentation software. Now, I think most of us are probably familiar with PowerPoint, but some other options are Google Slides or Prezi. And one that I really like to use in my classroom is one called Nearpod. Now, why do I like to use this? Well, it's very similar to my question answer software. I want to get more of my students engaged. I want a bigger number of students involved and answering questions, even asking questions. And so reducing that seat time so they're not just sitting and listening, but they're engaged with the material. And the reason I like to use Nearpod is because it uses, again, that second screen approach where I have my screen as the teacher and my students can watch my lecture, watch my presentation on their cell phone screens. So let's take a look at how that works. Now, where Nearpod is a little bit different than PowerPoint is that I can control the slides even though my students are watching on their cell phones. So I have a very traditional PowerPoint type of presentation where I can put pictures, I can put text. So something we're all familiar with, very traditional type of teaching there with my PowerPoint presentation. But what's great about Nearpod is that I can also put questions directly into my PowerPoint for my students to answer. So I can ask open-ended questions, and I can make several kind of lecture slides in a row, and then I can add in a question. And as students answer the question on their own device, I see their answers appear on my teacher screen. So while we're doing the lecture, they can answer my questions and I can see each student's name, each student's answer, and if they're participating in the class, I can share a student's answer with the rest of the class. Or I could call on a specific student and they could share their answer with the rest of the class as well. Another great option about Nearpod versus a traditional PowerPoint lecture is I can add video directly into my presentation that students can watch at their own pace. So again, the idea here is to move beyond students passively learning the material, just sitting and listening, but getting them to interact with the information and getting them to interact with me, the teacher, during the presentation. Now, another part that I like about Nearpod is I can also add quiz questions directly to my presentation. So I can quiz students on the material immediately after we discuss it, which I really like. As students answer on their screens, I get real-time updates on my teacher screen that shows me how well my students are doing. And I really like this as a teacher because I can see if all of my students are getting the information correct. And if my students are getting the information wrong, a lot of my students are getting the information wrong, that tells me maybe I didn't teach that very well. So, this software can help us be better teachers as well because we can see each of our students' names, we can see their score, which questions they got correct in green, which questions they got wrong in red, and then I get to see an overall percentage of my students. So 67% of my class got this correct, 33% got it incorrect. So I get that real-time data right in my lecture. So I'm able to lecture, quiz, and evaluate all at the same time, which is a really great feature. Now, another part that I like about Nearpod is that I can get all of the questions that I asked during my presentation saved. So I can see how well each student did with the material. I can save this to my gradebook and keep that as an evaluation, as an assessment of my students. And again, I like this as an example of how I can use technology to make a traditional classroom approach, such as a lecture or a presentation, more informative for both me and my students. So as you see here, this is one of my session reports from my Nearpod that shows me how well each student did with the material. And again, I can save that, I can download it to my computer, I can put it in my grade book, and I have that information available. So again, a really great chance to teach the material, test the material, and evaluate the material all at the same time. So again, something that we're quite familiar with as teachers. We're used to presentations and something like PowerPoint, but this uses a blended learning approach to expand out what a lecture can do by using these internet-based tools. Now, the last tool that I want to look at is a quizzing tool. So I always like to have some form of assessment in my class. Of course, as a teacher, we're going to do assessment, but how do I make assessment a little less stressful? Thinking about the test. Sometimes my students just aren't good test takers. So how can I make quizzes more fun? And how can I help students who are not normally good test takers? So again, I consider this a positive impact on my students. Thinking about Carol Chappell's criteria, getting them to have more fun and be more open and take risks in their quizzes can be really helpful in a lot of ways for our students. So how do we do that? Well, there's lots of great options. We have things like Plickers, Google Forms, Quizlet, Kahoot, and there are many more options. And what I like to use is Kahoot because it allows me to evaluate my students in a fun and engaging way. And that's a positive impact. So how does Kahoot work? Well, it helps us by getting, again, more of our students engaged. So instead of one or two students answering all the questions, we can get everybody answering it. It helps me by telling me how well each student is doing. It gives me an assessment. It gives me an evaluation of my students. And again, I'm reducing that seat time. My students aren't just sitting and listening, but they're engaged. They're doing something. So that's kind of the basics of how it works. And let's look at specifically, how does the Kahoot website function? Well, as the teacher, I set up my quiz. And once I have the quiz set up, I can invite my students. And both Kahoot and Nearpod that we looked at use a pin that the students can use to get into my quiz. So I give this pin to my students. They can type that in on their computer, their tablet, their phone, and they can do that by going to Kahoot.it. That's the website. And when they go to Kahoot.it, they put in the pin, and that takes them into my quiz. Now, what's nice about this is each time I do the quiz, the pin will be different. So if I'm teaching a 9 o'clock class and I'm teaching a 10 o'clock class, when I restart the quiz, that pin will change. So it's unique each time I use it. Now, once I get the quiz started, it's a pretty simple setup. And again, it uses that second screen approach. The students can join in with their names. So on their phone, they're entering their names and they're preparing for the quiz. And on the teacher screen, we'll see their names come up. Now, once I start the quiz, the teacher screen will have the question, and it will have 4 buttons on the bottom: red, blue, yellow, and green with answers. The students have to choose the correct answer on their phones. So their screens, their second screens, look like this. They're just 4 big buttons. So they have to be able to see the teacher screen to read the answers, but then on their phone, they just press the correct button. The faster a student answers, the more points they will get. So each question is worth 1,000 points, and the faster I reply, the more points I can get. So there's a game element to this. It turns a quiz into a game. Students can play individually, or they could play in groups. And once I ask a question, once all the students have answered, we get the results immediately, and we can see how well the class did. So how many people answered each question with which answer. So that's a really great feedback mechanism that happens after every question. And as I mentioned, each question is worth points. So there's a student who's in first place, there's a student who's in second place. So it gives them a chance to kind of play and compete a little bit. And again, maybe if I want my students to work together, I might have them compete in teams to make it more of a positive impact by working together. And so, thinking about some of these tools, there's a lot of great ways that we can bring these tools into our classroom. Quizzing tools, for instance, like Kahoot, can be fun to get our students more engaged with classroom material. It can be great for large classes, things like that. And what I want to stress is there are many more tools out there. If you join us on the Ning, you come over to our discussion after the webinar. Would love to hear your ideas and what tools you like to use. And if you haven't used any of these tools and you're not sure where to begin, think about the 6 criteria for the tools that we just looked at. Think about each tool in terms of language learning potential. Will it fit your learners? Will it be authentic? Will it have a positive impact? And is it practical for your teaching context? The tools that we looked at today may not have the practicality for your classroom, but I'm sure other tools out there do. The best way to learn about those is to get together with our colleagues, share ideas. And so that's what our webinar is for. That's what the American English Ning is for as well. So join us over there, and I'd love to hear your ideas, because we covered a lot of material today. And I encourage everybody to take the time to explore these tools at your own pace. Even better, explore them with a colleague, with other teachers at your school or in your community, and think about how they should fit into your classroom practice, how you can start building out a blended learning classroom to take advantage of learning opportunities anywhere, whether they're in the real world or on the internet. And keep in mind Chappelle's framework, because it can really help us better understand how these tools should fit into our classroom. And of course, knowing all these terms, and knowing all the tools can really help us better explain and show these tools to our friends and colleagues. Some of us aren't able to use these tools in the classroom. Well, now's a great time to learn about them, because soon you will be able to. Technology always keeps moving forward. So keep it in mind. And, thank you for attending. I'm glad you could be here. I hope you join.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for sharing that helpful framework for evaluating educational technology tools, and also for pointing out some very specific new ways that such tools are being used to support EFL instruction. I feel like tech tools change so quickly, and that there's so many out there that it's great to have a structured way to think about how to effectively select them and then bring these tools into our specific teaching context. So a big thank you, Jeff.